Imagine a philosophy so potent it was consumed by the very forces it sought to destroy. Nietzsche's Übermensch, a figure meant to embody the audacity of creating meaning in a meaningless universe, has been warped into a weapon for the shallowest forms of power. Social media influencers flaunt it as a hashtag for hustle culture. Authoritarian leaders invoke it to justify their cruelty. Even self-proclaimed free thinkers wield it like a cudgel to mock empathy as weakness. The tragedy? Nietzsche's Übermensch was never a celebration of might, but a rebellion against the poverty of spirit, a refusal to let society's decay dictate one's worth. Misreading it as a mandate for domination doesn't just bastardize a philosophical ideal, it feeds the crisis of meaning gnawing at modernity, where self-empowerment often masks exploitation, and authenticity is just another product to sell. The Übermensch isn't a flex of ego. It's a funeral pyre for the lies we've been fed about success, morality, and what it means to truly live. To misunderstand it is to surrender to the very nihilism Nietzsche fought. Let's incinerate the cliches, confront why this distortion thrives in our age of influencers and AI, and ask, what if the Übermensch isn't a relic but a mirror, one that's been cracked, smeared, and desperately needs repair? Friedrich Nietzsche was born on October 15, 1844, in a small town called Rocken, in what was then the Kingdom of Prussia, now part of modern-day Germany. His father was a Lutheran pastor, and his mother came from a deeply religious family, so Nietzsche was raised in a household where Christian beliefs were central to everyday life. However, his childhood was marked by tragedy when his father died unexpectedly in 1849, when Nietzsche was just 5 years old. His younger brother died shortly after, leaving Nietzsche, his mother, and his sister in a household dominated by women. This early loss had a profound effect on Nietzsche, and may have contributed to his lifelong struggle with existential questions about suffering, death, and the meaning of life. Despite these hardships, he was an exceptionally intelligent child, excelling in school and developing a deep love for music, literature, and philosophy. Nietzsche's early education took place in prestigious schools where he quickly stood out as a gifted student. He studied classical philology, the study of ancient Greek and Roman texts, at the University of Bonn before transferring to the University of Leipzig. His academic abilities were so extraordinary that, at just 24 years old, he was offered a professorship at the University of Basel in Switzerland. This was an almost unheard of achievement for someone so young, and it seemed as though Nietzsche was destined for a life of intellectual success. However, despite his promising career, he was never fully comfortable in academic settings. He found the rigid structure of university life stifling and began to develop ideas that would eventually place him at odds with many of his colleagues. Around this time, he discovered the works of Arthur Schopenhauer, a German philosopher who argued that life was full of suffering and that human desires only led to frustration. While Nietzsche admired Schopenhauer's intellectual depth, he ultimately rejected his pessimistic view of life and sought a more affirmative, life-affirming philosophy. One of the most significant influences on Nietzsche's thinking came from his friendship with the famous composer Richard Wagner. Wagner was not only a brilliant musician, but also a passionate advocate of German nationalism and mythology. And for a time, Nietzsche saw him as a father figure. They shared a deep appreciation for art, music, and the power of culture to shape human existence. However, Nietzsche later became disillusioned with Wagner, particularly because of his increasing association with anti-Semitism and his embrace of conservative Christian values. Nietzsche eventually broke ties with Wagner, a painful separation that mirrored his broader rejection of traditional beliefs and authority figures. This was part of a larger pattern in Nietzsche's life, in which he repeatedly distanced himself from the institutions and ideas he once admired, choosing instead to carve his own philosophical path. By the late 1870s, Nietzsche's health began to decline. He suffered from chronic migraines, severe stomach problems, and deteriorating eyesight, conditions that would plague him for the rest of his life. His physical suffering was so intense that he was forced to resign from his university position at Basel in 1879, at just 34 years old. From that point on, he lived as an independent writer and thinker, wandering across Europe in search of a climate that would ease his suffering. He spent time in Switzerland, Italy, and the south of France, often living in solitude and dedicating himself entirely to his writing. This period of isolation allowed him to develop some of his most radical and original ideas, but it also deepened his loneliness. Although he corresponded with a few friends and admirers, he had very few close relationships and never married. His attempts at romantic relationships, including his well-known admiration for the intellectual Lou Andreas Salome, ended in rejection, adding to his feelings of isolation. Despite his physical and emotional struggles, Nietzsche's most important works were written during this period of wandering and solitude. Books like Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Beyond Good and Evil, and The Genealogy of Morals challenged traditional beliefs about morality, religion, and human nature. One of his most controversial arguments was his rejection of Christianity, which he saw as a belief system that encouraged weakness, guilt, and submission. Nietzsche believed that traditional morality, especially Christian morality, was based on the idea that suffering was noble and that people should seek humility and obedience. He argued that this way of thinking made people passive and fearful, preventing them from reaching their full potential. Instead, he proposed a new way of thinking in which individuals would create their own values and strive for greatness rather than conforming to societal expectations. This idea, which he later developed into the concept of the Übermensch, was a direct challenge to the religious and moral traditions that had shaped European civilization for centuries. Nietzsche's radical ideas were not widely understood or accepted during his lifetime. He was largely ignored by the academic world, and his books sold very few copies. He lived in near poverty, surviving on a small pension from his university and occasional financial support from friends. His health continued to deteriorate, and by 1889 he suffered a complete mental breakdown. The exact cause of his collapse is still debated, but he spent the last 11 years of his life in a state of mental and physical decline, unable to write or communicate coherently. He was cared for by his mother and later by his sister, who manipulated his work to fit her own nationalist and anti-Semitic views. This distortion of his philosophy contributed to later misinterpretations, including the Nazi appropriation of his ideas, something Nietzsche himself would have strongly opposed. He died on August 25, 1900, at the age of 55, leaving behind a body of work that would go on to influence philosophy, literature, psychology, and political thought for generations. Friedrich Nietzsche's life was one of immense intellectual ambition, but also deep suffering and loneliness. He was a thinker who refused to accept easy answers, constantly questioning the foundations of morality, religion, and human nature. His rejection of traditional values was not simply rebellion for its own sake, but a call for humanity to rise above outdated beliefs and embrace life with courage and creativity. Despite being misunderstood during his lifetime, his ideas have had a lasting impact, inspiring thinkers such as Jean-Paul Sartre, Michel Foucault, and even psychologists like Carl Jung and Sigmund Freud. Nietzsche's life and work serve as a powerful example of what it means to pursue truth relentlessly, even at great personal cost. He remains one of the most provocative and influential philosophers in history, and his vision of human potential continues to challenge and inspire those willing to engage with his ideas. Friedrich Nietzsche lived during one of the most transformative periods in European history, a time when traditional ways of thinking were being challenged by rapid advancements in science, industry, and philosophy. The 19th century was marked by the rise of scientific rationalism, which questioned long-held religious beliefs and replaced them with a new focus on reason, logic, and empirical evidence. For centuries, Christianity had provided a framework for understanding morality, purpose, and the structure of society, but this foundation was beginning to crumble. Discoveries in biology, particularly Charles Darwin's theory of evolution, challenged the biblical account of creation and suggested that human beings were not divinely designed, but rather the product of natural selection. Advances in medicine, chemistry, and physics further demonstrated that the world could be explained through natural laws rather than supernatural forces. As people placed greater trust in science and reason, religious faith began to decline, and traditional moral values were increasingly questioned. Nietzsche observed this shift with both excitement and deep concern. He saw the collapse of religious certainty as an opportunity for human beings to create new values. But he also feared that without religion, many people would fall into nihilism, the belief that life has no inherent meaning or purpose. He warned that if people did not find new sources of meaning, they would become weak, directionless, and incapable of achieving greatness. At the same time, the Industrial Revolution was transforming European society in ways that had never been seen before. Factories replaced traditional craftsmanship, machines took over tasks that had once been done by hand, and urbanization rapidly increased as people moved to cities in search of work. This shift created enormous economic growth and technological progress, but it also brought with it deep social problems. The gap between the rich and the poor widened. Working conditions in factories were often brutal, and many people found themselves trapped in monotonous, dehumanizing labor. Cities became overcrowded, pollution increased, and new forms of alienation emerged as people lost their connection to nature and traditional ways of life. Nietzsche saw this industrialized world as one that encouraged mediocrity and conformity. He believed that modern society was producing individuals who were more focused on comfort and convenience than on striving for greatness. He was especially critical of what he called the last man, a type of person who seeks only security, pleasure, and ease, while avoiding risk, struggle, and self-overcoming. He feared that if people became too comfortable in this industrialized and increasingly secular world, they would lose the ability to push themselves toward higher achievements. The 19th century was also a time of major political and social upheaval. Revolutions and nationalist movements were sweeping across Europe, challenging old monarchies and demanding new forms of government. The French Revolution had already shaken the foundations of traditional authority at the end of the 18th century, and its effects were still being felt throughout the continent. In Germany, where Nietzsche was born, the unification of the country under Otto von Bismarck created a powerful new empire, but it also intensified debates about nationalism, war, and the role of the state. Many people turned to ideologies like socialism and communism, which promised to address the injustices of industrial capitalism and create a more equal society. Karl Marx, writing during Nietzsche's lifetime, argued that history was shaped by class struggle and that the working class would eventually overthrow the ruling elites. While Nietzsche agreed that modern society was in a state of crisis, he rejected the socialist vision of equality, believing instead that true progress came not from making everyone the same, but from individuals pushing themselves to become exceptional. He was deeply skeptical of mass movements, seeing them as another form of herd mentality that discouraged independent thought and creativity. Philosophically, the 19th century was a time of intense debate about morality and the nature of human existence. Traditional ethical systems, many of which had been based on Christian teachings, were being questioned by new thinkers who sought to redefine morality in secular terms. Utilitarian philosophers like John Stuart Mill argued that morality should be based on the principle of maximizing happiness for the greatest number of people, while existentialist thinkers like Søren Kierkegaard explored the struggle of individual faith and meaning in a world that seemed increasingly indifferent to human concerns. Nietzsche entered this intellectual landscape with radical ideas that set him apart from both religious and secular moralists. He argued that most moral systems, whether based on religion or reason, were built on a foundation of weakness and fear. He believed that traditional morality, particularly Christian morality, encouraged people to suppress their instincts, deny their own strength, and accept suffering as a virtue. Instead, he called for a new way of thinking about morality, one that embraced life, power, and creativity rather than guilt, obedience, and self-denial. He saw the rise of scientific rationalism and the decline of religious faith as a moment of great potential, but also one of great danger. If people could not create their own values in the absence of religion, they would be left with nothing but despair and mediocrity. Nietzsche's critique of modern society was not just theoretical but deeply personal. He saw himself as an outsider, someone who lived outside the norms and expectations of his time. He was highly critical of the cultural trends around him, particularly what he saw as the growing weakness and complacency of European civilization. He believed that modern people were too afraid of struggle and too eager to seek comfort, and he saw this as a sign of cultural and moral decline. He was also highly critical of democracy, which he saw as a system that encouraged mediocrity by treating all people as equals, rather than recognizing that some individuals were capable of far greater achievements than others. For Nietzsche, the true purpose of humanity was not to create a comfortable or equal society, but to push beyond its limitations and give rise to individuals who could achieve greatness. The cultural and intellectual climate of Nietzsche's time was one of rapid change, uncertainty, and crisis. Old beliefs were crumbling, new ideologies were competing for dominance, and traditional ways of life were being transformed by industrialization and scientific progress. Nietzsche saw this as both an opportunity and a danger. He believed that the decline of religious faith and traditional morality could allow for the emergence of a new kind of human being, one who was strong, independent, and capable of creating their own meaning in life. But he also feared that most people would not rise to this challenge. Instead, they would seek easy answers, follow the herd, and embrace a life of passive conformity. His writings were a call to arms, a challenge to individuals to rise above the mediocrity of modern society and strive for something greater. His critique of the weakness of European civilization was not just a philosophical argument, but a passionate warning about what he saw as the potential downfall of human greatness. Nietzsche's ideas were shocking to many of his contemporaries, but they remain deeply relevant today as people continue to grapple with the same questions about meaning, morality, and the role of the individual in a rapidly changing world. When Nietzsche famously declared God is dead in his book The Gay Science in 1882, he was not making a literal statement about the physical death of a divine being, but rather describing a profound cultural and philosophical shift taking place in Europe. For centuries, religion had been the foundation of Western civilization, providing moral guidance, a sense of purpose, and a shared understanding of human existence. Christianity, in particular, had shaped the way people thought about right and wrong, life and death, suffering and salvation. But by the 19th century, this foundation was beginning to erode. Advances in science, the rise of rational thought, and the growing emphasis on human reason over divine revelation led many people to question traditional religious beliefs. The theory of evolution challenged the biblical account of creation. The scientific method provided explanations for natural phenomena that had once been attributed to the divine. Philosophers and intellectuals increasingly sought to understand morality, society, and existence through reason rather than faith. Nietzsche saw this growing secularism as an irreversible process. The idea of God, which had once given structure to life, was losing its power. His statement that God is dead was not a celebration, but a diagnosis. It was his way of saying that belief in God was fading, and that the world was moving into a new and uncertain era where old religious certainties no longer held sway. Nietzsche believed that the death of God was one of the most significant events in human history, but he also saw it as deeply dangerous. For centuries, religion had given people meaning, purpose, and a framework for understanding morality. It had provided a reason for suffering and a promise of eternal reward. Without religion, many people faced an existential crisis. If there was no God, then what was the foundation of morality? If there was no divine plan, then what was the purpose of life? Nietzsche feared that in the absence of religious faith, people might fall into nihilism, the belief that life is meaningless and that there are no ultimate truths or moral values. He saw this as a potential catastrophe because without meaning, people could become directionless, passive, and weak. Without belief in higher values, society could descend into moral chaos or simply drift into empty hedonism, where people seek only pleasure and avoid deeper questions about existence. He saw this as a critical moment in history, one that demanded a response. If God was dead, humanity needed to find a new way to create meaning. The question was, how? Nietzsche rejected the idea that humanity should simply replace God with another absolute authority, such as science, reason, or the state. He was deeply skeptical of any system that imposed rigid universal truths on people. He believed that each individual had to take responsibility for creating their own values, rather than blindly accepting those handed down by tradition. He argued that rather than mourning the death of God, humanity should see it as an opportunity to grow, to evolve, and to become something greater. This is where his concept of the Übermensch comes in. The Übermensch is the individual who does not rely on external sources of meaning, but instead creates their own. Rather than submitting to religious morality, social norms, or political ideologies, the Übermensch rises above them and carves their own path. Nietzsche saw this as the only way forward in a world where God no longer played a central role. The death of God was not just about the loss of religious belief, but about the broader collapse of traditional values. The challenge was not simply to replace religion with science or politics, but to completely rethink how human beings approach meaning and morality. Nietzsche understood that this was an incredibly difficult task. Most people, he believed, were not ready to live without the comfort of absolute truths. He described the danger of the last man, a person who responds to the death of God by retreating into a life of comfort, safety, and shallow pleasures. The last man does not seek greatness or deeper meaning. Instead, he seeks a life of ease, avoiding challenges, risks, and deep thinking. Nietzsche saw this as the fate of many people in modern society, who, rather than facing the existential crisis of meaning, simply distract themselves with entertainment, materialism, and conformity. He feared that without God, many would choose the path of least resistance rather than striving to create something new. He saw this as a form of cultural and moral decline, a sign that humanity was losing its strength and vitality. But he also saw another possibility, one that was much more difficult, but also much more rewarding. If humanity could embrace the challenge of creating its own values, it could reach new heights of intellectual, artistic, and moral achievement. The death of God, rather than being the end of meaning, could be the beginning of a new and higher form of human existence. Nietzsche's declaration that God is dead was not meant to be taken lightly. It was not just an observation about declining religious belief, but a profound recognition that the foundations of Western civilization were shifting in ways that would change everything. It was a warning that without new sources of meaning, society could fall into despair or mediocrity. But it was also an invitation to rise above that despair and to take control of one's own destiny. Nietzsche did not want people to simply replace one belief system with another. He wanted them to become creators of meaning, to take the place of the gods they once worshipped. He saw this as the greatest challenge facing humanity and the ultimate test of its strength. The death of God, in Nietzsche's eyes, was both a crisis and an opportunity. It was the moment when humanity could either fall into nihilism or rise to something greater. It was the point at which people had to decide whether they would be the last men, seeking only comfort and security, or whether they would strive to become something more, embracing life with courage and creativity. The question Nietzsche left for the future was not whether God was truly dead, but what humanity would do in the wake of his death. Would people retreat into despair, or would they take up the challenge of creating their own values and living with strength, passion, and purpose? Nihilism, according to Nietzsche, was one of the greatest dangers facing humanity after the decline of religious belief. For centuries, people had relied on religion to provide meaning, structure, and moral guidance in their lives. God was seen as the ultimate source of truth, the foundation upon which morality was built, and the answer to the deepest questions about human existence. But as science, philosophy, and modern thinking challenged religious doctrines, many people began to lose faith in these old certainties. Nietzsche saw this as an inevitable historical process, but he also recognized the immense psychological and social consequences that came with it. Without God, people could no longer rely on the idea of divine purpose or eternal rewards to justify their suffering or guide their actions. This left them in a state of existential uncertainty, where nothing seemed to have ultimate meaning. Nietzsche called this crisis nihilism, a condition in which people believe that life has no purpose, no higher values, and no fundamental truths. He saw nihilism as a sickness, a deep spiritual crisis that could lead individuals and entire societies into despair, passivity, or blind obedience to old traditions that no longer held real significance. Nietzsche feared that faced with the abyss of meaninglessness, most people would react in one of two ways. Some would fall into deep despair, overwhelmed by the thought that nothing truly matters. Without a higher purpose, without absolute moral guidelines, they would feel lost, empty, and directionless. This kind of nihilism could lead to depression, apathy, and a sense of complete hopelessness. Others, however, would react by clinging even more tightly to the old values and traditions that had already begun to lose their power. Instead of confronting the reality of nihilism, they would refuse to think for themselves and blindly accept outdated beliefs just to avoid facing the terrifying idea that meaning is not given, but must be created. This second reaction, Nietzsche believed, was just as dangerous as the first. People who refused to question old beliefs were not truly overcoming nihilism. They were simply avoiding it, living in a state of denial rather than embracing the challenge of finding or creating new meaning for themselves. One of Nietzsche's most famous warnings about the dangers of nihilism was his concept of the last man. He described the last man as a type of person who, instead of confronting life's deepest questions, chooses to live in comfort, security, and shallow pleasure. The last man does not seek greatness, nor does he struggle to create meaning for himself. Instead, he seeks only an easy and predictable life. He avoids pain, avoids risk, and avoids anything that forces him to think too deeply about his existence. Nietzsche saw this as the ultimate failure of humanity, a state in which people become weak, uninspired, and complacent. In a world ruled by the last men, Society would be focused only on material comforts and superficial happiness, with no ambition to rise above mediocrity. Instead of striving for something higher, people would seek entertainment, convenience, and stability, but at the cost of their true potential. Nietzsche saw signs of this already happening in his own time, as industrialization and mass culture encouraged people to value comfort over challenge and security over self-discovery. He feared that, without a new guiding philosophy, humanity would sink into a state of passive existence, avoiding the difficult but necessary task of creating meaning for themselves. Nietzsche did not believe that nihilism was the end of the story. He saw it as a transition, a difficult but necessary stage in human development. If humanity could move beyond nihilism instead of falling into despair or blind obedience, then a new kind of person could emerge, one who was strong enough to create values rather than simply accepting them. This is where his idea of the Übermensch becomes essential. The Übermensch, or Overman, is Nietzsche's answer to nihilism. Instead of surrendering to meaninglessness or clinging to outdated traditions, the Übermensch rises above both and creates meaning for himself. He does not need external authority, whether religious, political, or cultural, to tell him what to believe. He takes full responsibility for his own existence, shaping his values according to his own vision rather than following the herd. The Übermensch does not fear suffering or struggle. He embraces them as necessary parts of life. Where the last man seeks only comfort, the Übermensch seeks greatness. Where the last man avoids risk and deep thought, the Übermensch confronts existence head-on and transforms it into something meaningful through his own strength and creativity. Nietzsche believed that the Übermensch was necessary because he represented the next stage of human evolution, not in a biological sense, but in a philosophical and spiritual sense. Humanity could not remain trapped between the old world of religious certainty and the empty void of nihilism forever. Either people would retreat into weakness and stagnation, or they would push forward into something new. The Übermensch was Nietzsche's vision of that something new. He was the person who would affirm life, not in the way that religious believers had done by placing their hope in an afterlife, but by embracing the reality of this world and shaping it into something valuable. He would not rely on external rewards or fear of punishment to guide his actions. Instead, he would find fulfillment in creativity, strength, and self-overcoming. The Übermensch does not seek power over others, but power over himself, constantly striving to push beyond his own limits and reach new heights of personal achievement. Nietzsche understood that this was not an easy path. Most people would prefer the security of the last man to the challenge of the Übermensch. It takes immense courage to face the world without relying on traditional moral systems and to take full responsibility for one's own values. But Nietzsche believed that this was the only way forward. If humanity did not rise above nihilism, it would be doomed to mediocrity, trapped in a world where people seek only comfort and avoid the true challenge of existence. He saw this struggle as one that every individual must face in their own way. Each person has the choice to either fall into nihilism, passively accept old beliefs, or take the harder but more rewarding path of self-overcoming. The Übermensch was not just a theoretical idea, it was a call to action, a challenge to every individual to rise above the ordinary and strive for something higher. Nietzsche's vision of the Übermensch remains relevant today because the problem of nihilism has not gone away. Many people still struggle with questions of meaning, still feel lost in a world without clear moral authority, and still seek easy answers instead of facing the challenge of creating their own values. In a time when consumerism, mass entertainment, and digital distractions encourage people to live as last men, Nietzsche's warning about nihilism is more important than ever. His philosophy offers an alternative, a path not of blind obedience or passive despair, but of strength, creativity, and self-transformation. He does not promise that this path will be easy, but he suggests that it is the only way to truly overcome nihilism and live a life of depth, purpose, and meaning. In the face of a world where traditional values are constantly questioned and new sources of meaning are difficult to find, the need for the Übermensch is just as urgent now as it was in Nietzsche's time. Nietzsche's idea of the Übermensch, introduced in Thus Spoke Zarathustra between 1883 and 1885, is one of the most challenging and widely misunderstood concepts in philosophy. The Übermensch, or Overman, is not simply a superior human being in the physical or intellectual sense, but rather an entirely new kind of person who has freed themselves from the limitations of traditional morality, religious dogma, and societal expectations. Nietzsche saw the Übermensch as the answer to the crisis of nihilism, the condition in which people struggle to find meaning in a world where old beliefs have lost their power. Unlike those who react to the death of God with despair or blind obedience to outdated values, the Übermensch rises above these limitations and creates their own purpose. This is not an easy task, nor is it something that everyone is capable of achieving. The Übermensch is not born but made through intense self-overcoming, a process that requires the rejection of passive conformity and the fearless embrace of life in all its complexity. This higher state of being is not defined by wealth, intelligence, or social status, but by the ability to take full responsibility for one's own existence. The Übermensch does not need external validation, religious promises, or societal approval. Instead, they live by values they have created themselves, finding meaning through creativity, strength, and an unshakable affirmation of life. One of the most important aspects of the Übermensch is that they go beyond the traditional ideas of good and evil. Nietzsche argued that morality, particularly the Christian moral system that had dominated Western thought for centuries, was designed to keep people weak and obedient. He believed that religious morality encouraged people to deny their instincts, fear their own power, and submit to an external authority rather than thinking for themselves. The Übermensch is someone who rejects these imposed moral codes and instead builds their own ethical framework, one that is based on personal excellence, self-expression, and a love of life rather than guilt, obedience, and fear. This does not mean that the Übermensch is immoral or ruthless. Nietzsche was not advocating for a world without ethics, but rather for a world where morality is not dictated from above but created from within. The Übermensch does not seek power over others, but rather mastery over themselves. They are not controlled by resentment, jealousy, or the need for revenge, but instead live with a deep sense of inner strength, joy, and creative energy. By overcoming the limitations of traditional morality, they become free to explore their full potential and embrace life with a fearless and adventurous spirit. There have been many misconceptions about the Übermensch, some of which have had serious historical consequences. Perhaps the most damaging misunderstanding was the way the concept was misinterpreted and misused by the Nazis in the 20th century. Nietzsche himself was deeply critical of nationalism, racism, and blind obedience to the state. Yet after his death, his ideas were distorted by his sister, Elisabeth Forster Nietzsche, who had strong ties to the nationalist and anti-Semitic movements in Germany. She edited and manipulated his writings to fit her own ideological beliefs, and as a result, the Nazis later adopted a twisted version of the Übermensch to justify their ideas of racial superiority and dictatorship. This was completely against Nietzsche's original meaning. The Übermensch was never about one race being superior to others, nor was it about political power or military conquest. It was a deeply personal and philosophical ideal, one that could be achieved by individuals regardless of their background. It was not about ruling over others, but about mastering oneself. Another common misconception is that the Übermensch is purely selfish, an individual who disregards others and seeks personal gain at any cost. This interpretation also misrepresents Nietzsche's vision. While the Übermensch does not conform to societal expectations, they are not simply egoistic or reckless. They are driven by creativity, excellence, and the desire to live authentically, not by cruelty or domination. In order to understand the Übermensch in a more practical way, it helps to compare it to real-life figures who embody some of its qualities. Nietzsche never gave a concrete example of an Übermensch because he saw it as an evolving ideal rather than a fixed type of person. But we can see echoes of the concept in people who have broken free from tradition and created something entirely new. Think of Leonardo da Vinci, an artist and scientist who defied the conventional thinking of his time and pursued knowledge across multiple fields without limitation. He was not content with simply following the rules of the Renaissance. He pushed beyond them, inventing new techniques in painting, anatomy, and engineering. Or consider Virginia Woolf, a writer who rejected traditional storytelling structures and pioneered new forms of literature that explored the depths of human consciousness in ways that had never been done before. She did not accept the limitations placed on women in her era, but instead forged a new path for creative expression and intellectual independence. A modern example might be someone like Elon Musk, not in the sense of his business success alone, but in his relentless drive to push the boundaries of what is possible, whether in space exploration, electric vehicles, or artificial intelligence. Each of these individuals, in different ways, refused to accept the world as it was given to them, and instead reshaped it through their own vision, creativity, and determination. The key characteristic of the Übermensch is that they do not simply follow the existing rules of society, but instead create their own ways of thinking and living. They are not content to simply accept what is handed down to them, whether in morality, art, science, or philosophy. They question, they challenge, and they innovate. This does not mean that everyone should strive to be an artist or an inventor, but rather that each person must take responsibility for shaping their own values and path in life instead of passively following the herd. The Übermensch is not an unreachable ideal, but a call to rise above mediocrity, to push beyond limitations, and to embrace life fully with all its suffering and joys. Nietzsche saw this as the only true way forward for humanity. If people did not take on this challenge, they would either fall into nihilism, believing that nothing matters, or become last men, seeking only comfort and avoiding deep thought. The Übermensch, by contrast, is fully engaged with life, constantly growing, learning, and transforming themselves. Nietzsche's vision is not a promise of an easy life, but a challenge to live with intensity, creativity, and a fearless embrace of the unknown. He believed that this was the only way to overcome the limitations of the past and move toward a future where human beings could reach their highest potential. Nietzsche describes the journey of personal transformation in three symbolic stages: the camel, the lion, and the child. These stages represent different levels of psychological and philosophical development, marking the process of breaking free from external influences and becoming a truly independent and self-created individual. Each stage is a necessary step toward becoming the Übermensch, but Nietzsche emphasizes that most people remain stuck in the first stage, unable or unwilling to move beyond it. The transformation he describes is not easy and requires intense self-reflection, struggle, and courage. This journey is not just about intellectual growth, but about completely redefining one's relationship with morality, authority, and personal meaning. Nietzsche presents these stages in his book, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, using poetic and metaphorical language to illustrate how a person can evolve from being a passive follower to becoming a true creator of values. This is not just an abstract theory, but a deeply personal process that each individual must go through in their own way. It is a challenge to rise above the limitations of tradition, fear, and conformity, and to take full responsibility for shaping one's own life and beliefs. The first stage is the camel, which represents the burdened individual who carries the weight of tradition, duty, and societal expectations without questioning them. The camel is obedient and hardworking, willing to bear heavy loads because it believes that doing so is noble and necessary. This stage reflects how most people live their lives, accepting the moral and cultural systems handed down to them without ever truly examining their origins or legitimacy. The camel follows religious teachings, social norms, and ethical rules, not because it has chosen them freely, but because it has been taught that obedience is virtuous and that questioning authority is dangerous or wrong. The camel values humility, sacrifice, and duty, believing that submission to higher powers, whether religious, political, or cultural, is the proper way to live. Nietzsche does not dismiss this stage entirely, as it does serve a purpose. Carrying burdens requires strength, and those who live as camels often develop discipline and endurance. However, Nietzsche sees this as an incomplete and ultimately limiting way of life. The problem with the camel is that it never asks why it carries these burdens or whether they are truly necessary. It accepts suffering as meaningful simply because it has been told that it is. Nietzsche argues that to grow beyond this stage, a person must learn to question the values and beliefs they have inherited, rather than simply enduring them out of habit or fear. The second stage is the lion, which symbolizes the rebel who breaks free from the old structures and begins to challenge authority. The lion is powerful, fearless, and aggressive, rejecting the burdens that once weighed it down. This stage represents a radical rejection of traditional morality, religious doctrines, and societal norms. The lion sees that many of the values it once accepted without question are arbitrary or oppressive, and it seeks to destroy them. This is the stage of rebellion, of saying no to the external forces that have shaped one's beliefs and identity. Nietzsche describes the lion as necessary because true freedom requires breaking free from the constraints of the past. However, this stage is also incomplete because the lion is focused only on destruction, not creation. The lion fights against old values, but has not yet developed new ones to replace them. This is why Nietzsche warns that simply rejecting traditional morality is not enough. Many people go through this phase in adolescence or early adulthood, when they begin to question the beliefs they were raised with. A teenager rejecting religion, a scientist challenging outdated theories, or a philosopher criticizing the ethical systems of the past can all be seen as examples of the lion stage. But Nietzsche argues that rebellion alone is not the final goal. The lion is still defined by the past because it is reacting against it. True transformation requires moving beyond rebellion and into a stage of creation. The final stage is the child, which represents the true creator of values and the embodiment of the Übermensch. Unlike the lion, which is focused on destruction, the child is focused on creation. The child does not simply reject old beliefs. It invents new ways of thinking, living, and understanding the world. This stage represents a return to innocence, but not in the sense of ignorance or naivete. It is a higher form of innocence, one that comes after deep questioning and struggle. The child is playful, free, and imaginative, embracing life without fear or resentment. Nietzsche uses the image of the child to illustrate the mindset of someone who is no longer weighed down by the past and who lives with a sense of joy, creativity, and self-expression. The child does not look to external authorities for guidance. Instead, it finds meaning within itself. This stage is extremely difficult to reach because it requires not only the courage to destroy old values, but also the wisdom and strength to create new ones. The child does not seek approval or follow rules out of obligation. It lives according to its own inner sense of meaning and purpose. This is the stage of the artist, the philosopher, the visionary, the person who shapes their own reality rather than accepting the one given to them by society. Nietzsche believed that very few people reach this stage because most are either too comfortable carrying the burdens of the camel or too focused on rebellion like the lion. But those who do become true creators, living not by inherited values but by ones they have forged through their own experience and insight. This journey through the three stages of transformation is at the heart of Nietzsche's philosophy. It is not just a theoretical framework, but a challenge to each individual to examine their own life and see where they stand. Are they a camel, blindly following the traditions and moral codes imposed on them by others? Have they become a lion, fiercely rejecting authority and seeking to destroy old beliefs? Or have they reached the stage of the child, where they are no longer reacting to the past, but are instead creating their own future? Nietzsche's vision is not an easy one, as it requires people to take full responsibility for their existence and to have the courage to live according to their own values rather than those imposed upon them. This is why he saw the Übermensch as the highest goal of humanity. The Übermensch is not simply someone who is powerful or intelligent, but someone who has moved through all three stages and emerged as a true creator of meaning. In a world where many people are either stuck in passive obedience or endless rebellion, Nietzsche's idea of the child reminds us that the ultimate goal is not just to reject the old, but to create something new. This is what makes the Übermensch necessary. Without individuals who are capable of self-overcoming and self-creation, humanity would remain trapped in cycles of obedience and rebellion, never reaching its full potential. Nietzsche's challenge is to those who are willing to rise above these limitations and take control of their own destiny. The will to power is one of the most fundamental and complex ideas in Nietzsche's philosophy, a concept that he saw as the driving force behind all life, action, and ambition. At its core, the will to power is not about physical strength or domination over others, but about the deep internal drive to grow, evolve, and overcome limitations. Nietzsche believed that every living being, from the smallest plant to the most complex human mind, is motivated by this force. A tree stretching its roots deeper into the earth and its branches higher into the sky is an expression of the will to power. A child learning to walk, despite falling many times, is displaying this same instinct to push beyond limitations. Unlike philosophers before him, who saw human nature as driven by a desire for survival or happiness, Nietzsche argued that what truly defines life is not mere survival, but the relentless struggle to expand, improve, and assert oneself in the world. This is why he rejected the idea that people simply want to live in comfort or avoid pain. He saw that real fulfillment comes from overcoming obstacles, taking risks, and striving for something greater. The will to power is the energy behind every act of creativity, discovery, and self-improvement. It is what pushes artists to create masterpieces, thinkers to challenge conventional wisdom, and athletes to push the limits of human ability. One of the most important aspects of the will to power is that it is not about dominance over others. Many misunderstand Nietzsche's idea, assuming that he was advocating for a kind of ruthless competition where the strong crush the weak. But for Nietzsche, true power is not about controlling people or accumulating wealth. It is about mastering oneself, pushing beyond personal fears and limitations, and achieving greatness in one's own unique way. A person driven by the will to power does not seek power for its own sake, but instead aims to express their fullest potential. This could manifest in many different ways. For one person, it may mean pursuing excellence in art and creating something that challenges the way people see the world. For another, it could mean dedicating themselves to scientific discovery, pushing the boundaries of human knowledge. For someone else, it could mean training their body and mind to achieve extraordinary physical feats. In each case, the individual is not motivated by external rewards such as money, status, or approval, but by an internal need to push beyond what they were before. This is what Nietzsche meant by self-overcoming. It is the idea that true power comes not from ruling over others, but from constantly striving to become better than one's past self. A powerful example of the will to power in action is seen in the life of Steve Jobs. Jobs was not just an entrepreneur or businessman. He was a visionary who completely transformed the world of technology. What made him extraordinary was not just his intelligence or technical skill, but his relentless drive to challenge the status quo and create something entirely new. He was not satisfied with simply making computers. He wanted to revolutionize the way people interacted with technology. He challenged his engineers to build products that were not only functional, but beautifully designed, intuitive, and groundbreaking. He constantly pushed the limits of what was possible, refusing to accept mediocrity or compromise. His obsession with innovation and perfection often made him difficult to work with, but it also drove him to create some of the most influential products in modern history, from the Macintosh to the iPhone. Jobs was not motivated by money alone. He was already wealthy early in his career, yet he continued to push forward because his true motivation was not financial success, but the desire to bring his creative vision to life. This relentless pursuit of excellence, this refusal to settle for anything less than his highest potential, is a clear example of the will to power at work. Nietzsche would have seen Jobs as someone who embodied the spirit of self-overcoming, someone who was never content with what had already been achieved, but always pushed further. Jobs did not simply accept the world as it was given to him. He reshaped it according to his own vision. He rejected the idea that things had to be done a certain way just because they had always been done that way. He broke the rules, questioned conventional thinking, and forced people to look at technology and design in an entirely new light. This is exactly what Nietzsche meant by the will to power. It is the drive to create, to challenge, to grow, and to impose one's own unique perspective on the world. Jobs may not have consciously thought in Nietzschean terms, but his actions reflected the same fundamental principle. He did not just accept reality as it was. He bent it to his will, turning ideas into reality through sheer determination, creativity, and effort. The will to power is not just about achieving great things on a grand scale. It operates in everyday life as well. Every time a person decides to push themselves beyond their comfort zone, to take on a challenge, to learn something new, or to create something meaningful, they are acting according to the will to power. It is present in the musician who spends years mastering their instrument, in the scientist who refuses to accept easy answers, in the athlete who trains beyond their limits. Even in small ways, such as overcoming personal fears or striving for self-improvement, the will to power is at work. Nietzsche saw it as the essence of life itself, the force that drives all existence forward. He believed that those who embrace this force, who cultivate it within themselves and refuse to settle for mediocrity, are the ones who will rise above the ordinary and achieve true greatness. This is what distinguishes those who live fully from those who merely exist. The will to power is not about seeking control over the world, but about taking control of one's own destiny, shaping life according to one's own values, and striving endlessly to become something more. One of the biggest psychological challenges of Nietzsche's idea of the Übermensch is whether it is realistic to expect people to constantly create new values for themselves. Most human beings are shaped by the traditions, morals, and beliefs they inherit from their cultures, families, and societies. From a young age, people are taught what is right and wrong, what is acceptable and unacceptable, and what goals they should strive for in life. Nietzsche's vision of the Übermensch requires individuals to break free from these inherited structures and create their own values, which is an incredibly difficult task. It is not simply about rejecting existing beliefs, but about developing a deep and personal philosophy that is strong enough to guide one's actions and decisions in a world without external certainties. For most people, this is an overwhelming challenge. Living without the comfort of absolute moral rules can lead to confusion, doubt, and existential anxiety. The effort required to constantly rethink one's values and act according to them demands immense intellectual and emotional strength. It requires people to be fully aware of their decisions at all times, never relying on habit or convention, but always engaging in a process of self-reflection and self-overcoming. Many might find this exhausting, which raises the question of whether the Übermensch is something that every person can become, or whether it is only achievable for a select few who have the willpower, intelligence, and courage to live in such a radical way. If the Übermensch is truly an ideal that only a small number of people can reach, then what does that mean for the rest of humanity? Nietzsche did not believe that everyone would or should become an Übermensch. He saw most people as being stuck in the mindset of the herd, following societal norms and avoiding deep philosophical reflection. He believed that exceptional individuals, those capable of great artistic, intellectual, or personal achievements, would rise above the rest and redefine what it means to be human. However, this raises ethical concerns about whether Nietzsche's philosophy creates a division between those who are capable of self-overcoming and those who are not. If only a few individuals can achieve this higher state of being, then what is the role of the majority of people? Are they simply meant to follow and admire the Übermensch, or do they serve some other purpose? Nietzsche did not provide a clear answer, but his writing suggests that while not everyone will become an Übermensch, those who strive toward it, even if they never fully achieve it, will still lead richer and more meaningful lives than those who passively accept conventional morality. This suggests that while the ideal may not be accessible to all, the effort to move toward it can still be valuable. Another important concern is whether Nietzsche's idea of the Übermensch could be used to justify immoral actions. If the Übermensch creates their own values and does not follow traditional morality, does that mean they can act without regard for others? Could a person justify selfishness, cruelty, or violence by claiming that they are simply going beyond conventional ideas of good and evil? This has been one of the most controversial aspects of Nietzsche's philosophy. Some have interpreted his ideas as promoting a kind of moral relativism, where right and wrong become meaningless because individuals decide their own values. This interpretation has been used by dictators, ruthless politicians, and radical thinkers to justify oppressive or destructive actions. However, Nietzsche did not intend for the Übermensch to be a figure of tyranny or selfish domination. He did not believe that breaking free from traditional morality meant abandoning all ethical responsibility. Instead, he argued that morality should not be based on submission, guilt, or fear, but on strength, creativity, and a deep engagement with life. The Übermensch does not act out of cruelty or indifference, but out of a profound sense of purpose and self-expression. This raises the challenge of how to balance self-overcoming with compassion for others. If a person rejects traditional morality, how do they ensure that their new values still include kindness, justice, and respect for others? Nietzsche did not provide a simple answer, but his philosophy suggests that true strength does not come from dominating others, but from mastering oneself. The Übermensch does not need to prove their power through cruelty or destruction, but rather through the ability to shape their own existence in a meaningful and life-affirming way. Nietzsche's ideas about self-overcoming and personal transformation share similarities with other major philosophical traditions, particularly existentialism and Buddhism. Existentialist philosophers, like Jean-Paul Sartre and Albert Camus, also emphasized the importance of creating one's own meaning in a world without inherent purpose. Sartre argued that existence precedes essence, meaning that humans are not born with a predefined purpose, but must shape their own identity through their choices and actions. Camus explored the idea of the absurd, suggesting that life has no ultimate meaning, but that individuals can still create their own purpose by embracing life fully despite its lack of inherent direction. Both Sartre and Camus, like Nietzsche, rejected the idea that morality and meaning should come from external authorities and instead encouraged people to take responsibility for shaping their own lives. However, there is an important difference between existentialism and Nietzsche's philosophy. While existentialists often focus on the struggle of living in an indifferent universe, Nietzsche presents the Übermensch as a powerful and joyful figure, someone who does not merely accept the meaninglessness of life, but actively transforms it into something valuable. Existentialists tend to emphasize the weight of human freedom and responsibility, often portraying life as a burden, whereas Nietzsche sees life as something to be embraced with energy and creativity. Buddhism also shares some interesting similarities with Nietzsche's ideas, particularly in the concept of self-transformation. Like Nietzsche, Buddhist philosophy encourages individuals to break free from illusions and attachments and to cultivate a higher state of being through inner development. Buddhism teaches that suffering is caused by attachment to desires and external conditions, and that true enlightenment comes from letting go of these attachments and achieving inner peace. Nietzsche, however, takes a different approach. While Buddhism seeks to eliminate suffering by transcending desire, Nietzsche embraces suffering as an essential part of growth and self-overcoming. The Übermensch does not seek to escape pain, but to use it as fuel for transformation. For Nietzsche, struggle, hardship, and even suffering are not things to be avoided, but necessary experiences that shape an individual into something greater. In this way, his philosophy is almost the opposite of Buddhism. While both emphasize self-mastery and transformation, Buddhism seeks liberation through detachment, while Nietzsche seeks power and affirmation through engagement with life. These comparisons show that Nietzsche's philosophy is both unique and deeply challenging. The idea of the Übermensch forces people to confront their own potential, but also raises difficult questions about who can achieve such a state and how new values can be created without leading to ethical chaos. His rejection of traditional morality opens up the possibility of both great personal freedom and great ethical uncertainty. Can a society function if everyone creates their own values? Can there be justice if morality is no longer based on universal principles? These are questions that Nietzsche leaves open, encouraging each individual to find their own answers. His philosophy does not offer easy solutions, but instead demands that people take full responsibility for their own lives, their own beliefs, and their own transformation. The challenge of the Übermensch is not just intellectual, but deeply personal. It asks whether a person is willing to break free from the comforts of tradition and create something entirely new, even in the face of suffering, uncertainty, and resistance. This is why Nietzsche's ideas remain so powerful and controversial. They force people to think beyond conventional morality, to question their deepest assumptions, and to consider what it truly means to live authentically. Whether or not one agrees with Nietzsche, his vision of self-overcoming and personal transformation remains one of the most radical and thought-provoking ideas in the history of philosophy. Nietzsche's ideas are more relevant today than ever before, because modern society, dominated by social media, consumerism, and passive entertainment, has created a world filled with what he called the last men. The last men are those who seek comfort, pleasure, and security above all else, avoiding struggle, challenge, or deep thought. In today's world, this can be seen in the way people endlessly scroll through social media, consume entertainment without questioning it, and chase material wealth as if it were the highest goal in life. Many people avoid discomfort and difficulty, preferring to stay within their routines rather than confront the deeper questions of existence. They rely on external validation, seeking approval through likes, followers, and social status instead of defining their own values. This passive existence, where people conform to societal expectations and live without purpose beyond immediate gratification, is exactly what Nietzsche warned against. He saw it as a sign of cultural decline, where people no longer strive for greatness, but instead settle for mediocrity. The modern world, with its endless distractions and emphasis on superficial happiness, has made it easier than ever for people to live as last men, avoiding risk, avoiding discomfort, and ultimately, avoiding life itself. Nietzsche's idea of the Übermensch is a direct challenge to this way of living. The Übermensch is not concerned with fitting in or seeking approval, but instead dedicates themselves to creating, innovating, and pushing the limits of human potential. In modern life, this can take many forms. It could mean being an artist who challenges conventional ways of thinking, a scientist who explores new frontiers of knowledge, or an entrepreneur who creates revolutionary ideas instead of following established norms. The Übermensch does not wait for permission or validation from society, but takes control of their own destiny, shaping their life according to their own values rather than those imposed by others. They are willing to take risks, to step outside of their comfort zone, and to embrace the unknown. They do not fear failure because they see every challenge as an opportunity to grow. Instead of conforming to trends, they set their own course. Instead of following the herd, they lead with their own vision. Nietzsche's philosophy is not about rejecting society entirely, but about refusing to let society dictate who you are and what you should become. It is a call to break free from passive existence and to actively shape the world rather than simply exist within it. Living like an Übermensch in the modern world requires a mindset of constant learning, self-improvement, and breaking mental barriers. In a time when many people settle for easy entertainment and surface-level knowledge, the Übermensch is someone who seeks deeper understanding, always questioning and expanding their perspective. This does not mean simply accumulating knowledge, but actively engaging with ideas, challenging assumptions, and thinking critically. It means developing the ability to stand alone, to hold independent thoughts even when they go against popular opinion. Nietzsche believed that most people do not think for themselves, but simply adopt the beliefs of those around them. To live as an Übermensch means breaking free from this pattern, developing one's own ideas, and being willing to stand by them with confidence. This also requires an ability to push beyond mental and emotional limitations. Many people limit themselves by thinking they are not capable of achieving greatness, or that they must follow the expectations set by others. The Übermensch rejects these limitations, constantly striving to evolve beyond their past self. This is not about external success alone, but about internal mastery, the ability to shape oneself through discipline, creativity, and fearless self-expression. Another crucial aspect of living like an Übermensch is learning to accept suffering and turning it into growth. Modern society often teaches people to avoid pain and discomfort at all costs. Advertisements, entertainment, and consumer culture encourage people to seek pleasure, escape from problems, and find the easiest path forward. Nietzsche saw this avoidance of suffering as a weakness, a refusal to engage with the true nature of life. He believed that struggle and hardship were necessary for personal growth, and that greatness could only be achieved by those who embraced difficulties rather than running from them. The Übermensch does not see suffering as something to be feared, but as something to be used as fuel for transformation. Every challenge, every failure, and every painful experience is an opportunity to learn and evolve. Instead of becoming bitter or resentful, the Übermensch takes control of their suffering and turns it into a source of strength. This is one of the hardest but most important lessons in Nietzsche's philosophy. Many people allow hardship to break them, to make them passive or filled with regret. The Übermensch, by contrast, uses every experience as a stepping stone to become something greater. Ultimately, to live as an Übermensch is to live with a deep yes to life. This means affirming life fully, not just in moments of happiness, but in every aspect, including suffering, uncertainty, and imperfection. Many people wish for life to be different, hoping for a world without pain, without struggle, without difficulty. But Nietzsche's philosophy teaches that true fulfillment comes not from escaping life's hardships, but from embracing them completely. The Übermensch does not seek another life, a better life, or a perfect world. They take reality exactly as it is and say yes to all of it. This does not mean passively accepting injustice or suffering, but rather seeing every moment, good or bad, as an essential part of existence. It means approaching life with courage, embracing challenges with enthusiasm, and finding meaning not in some distant future, but in the present moment. Nietzsche's challenge to the modern world is to stop waiting for happiness, stop looking for external validation, and stop avoiding struggle. Instead, he calls on individuals to take control of their own lives, to create their own meaning, and to shape themselves into something extraordinary. This is not an easy path, but for Nietzsche, it is the only path worth taking. In an age where many people are content to live as last men, seeking comfort and avoiding risk, the call to live as an Übermensch is more urgent than ever.